As far as our biographies go, Chris is much more qualified than I am in actually studying trees. I'm just an amateur enthusiast tree wingnut. Chris, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add about yourself, and then I can start the slides and I can dive into a fuller introduction of our presentation.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the most qualified, but thank you for that generous introduction. Also with the Mini Trees Project, I studied ecology at Evergreen State College and am very interested in regenerative agriculture and alternative food systems. That's all.
So give me just a second here to share my screen. Okay. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so thanks for having us and inviting us. We are both with the Mini Trees Project, and currently we have about 3,000 chestnut trees that we have grown from seed and are distributing this fall through winter and spring. And so this evening we'll mostly be talking about chestnut trees, their history, botany, ecological and social roles, and their potential as an ecologically resilient food source in a changing climate. Both Chris and I are into nut trees in general, and a lot of what we are saying tonight about chestnuts could be applied to other nuts also. Walnuts, hazelnuts, Gary and tan oaks, beech and hickory nuts, and more. But for our purposes tonight, we'll try not to wander too far from the chestnut tree. So Chris is going to start out with a little background on chestnut trees, and then I'll talk a little bit about possibilities for carbon sequestration with larger scale urban forestry and agroforestry, and chestnuts as an alternative to fossil fuel intensive grain monoculture. And then we'll tell you a little bit more specifically about the Mini Trees Project, what we've been up to, how to get our trees, and some tips on chestnut tree care, planting, and propagation. So, Chris, I'll let you dive into the chestnut propaganda.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to try to sell you on chestnut trees because I'm totally in love with them. A few reasons I think chestnut trees are so great. For one, the nutritional value of them is incredible. They're very high in carbohydrates. They're a staple food that can be used in place of wheat for a lot of cooking. And they have tons of health benefits, including stronger bones, reduced risk of heart disease, improved brain function, better respiration, the list goes on. The trees grow fast and bear high yields. They have tons of ecological benefits that I'll get into in a little bit, and they can be used for other things than food, such as timber, firewood, habitat for other species, etc. So a little history of the chestnut. Little historical context. So chestnut is in the genus Castania. There's several species of this genus scattered throughout the world, many of which have hybridized due to human intervention. Fossils have been found as far back as 85 million years ago, scattered around the North Pole in places like Greenland and North America. So they've kind of spread down from the poles into different parts of the world and taken on different forms as individual species. So it's in the family Fagaceae with oaks and beeches. Next slide. So one of the species that came from this was the Japanese chestnut, Castania Kranata. It's called kuri in Japanese. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It was actually in cultivation before rice, so it has a really old historical use as a food source there. maybe 2 to 6,000 years in cultivation. It's chestnut blight resistant, which is why it's been crossed with a lot of European species to get some of the cultivars we have today. Chinese chestnuts, similar story, also blight resistant. The exact original range is not totally determined throughout Asia, but we know they've been there for a very long time, kind of all over Asia. It grows commonly in the wild as an understory tree and also in open space. It's also chestnut blight resistant, as I said. Next slide. I just wanted to show you all this really cool video that I find super inspiring for Chinese chestnuts and chestnut trees in general. I'm not going to play the video. That's just a screenshot of it, but it's a person called Li Ziki, and it's a really good look into rural China chestnut cultivation and also cooking. So then there's also the European sweet chestnut. And the picture here is of the 100-horse chestnut tree. This is the oldest living chestnut tree in the world, 2 to 4,000 years old, depending which botanist you ask. It's famous because the Queen of Aragon once took shelter with 100 knights under this tree. It's huge. It has a circumference of about 190 feet, or at least it did until it died back a couple hundred years ago, but it has since regrown into what you see in the picture on the left. So European chestnuts are thought to have come from Asia Minor, the Transcaucasia region, and spread throughout Europe. It was cultivated heavily on the Italian peninsula and then spread by Roman legions during their looting and plundering. But conversely, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, a lot of folks seeking kind of freedom from the failing throes of the empire planted these trees all over Europe. So during medieval Europe, this was a staple food source, and a lot of it spread, and like traditional cultivation is attributed to this period. So last but not least is the American chestnut, which is a beautiful and tragic tale that many of us know. So this form of the chestnut likely crossed the Bering Land Bridge long ago in the Great Dispersion from the poles. These trees were huge. They were 100 feet tall, up to 10-foot diameter, and historically one tree could feed a family of 4 for a year. They just showered food upon the earth. It was an important staple food for indigenous folks and early European settlers. In addition to food, it had a huge use as firewood, timber, just building in general, railroads, homes. A lot of the houses you might see on the East Coast that are really old are built or sited with chestnut timber. So that tree was more or less wiped out by the chestnut blight in the 1920s. There was up to 4 billion trees that died, and one of the greatest ecological disasters, naturally caused that we know of. This is attributed to, questionable Forest Service management, as they would cut down all trees within a mile radius of an infected tree, thus leaving no potential for evolution towards resistance of this blight. It's also attributed to the extinction of the passenger pigeon, which would bring seaborne nutrients from the sea and shower them across the North American continent on the East Coast. It also would feast upon the trees and open up kind of a mosaic of canopy openings, which are necessary for germination of new seeds. There's actually people trying to bring back the passenger pigeon. It's a further out plan, but people are trying to bring back the American chestnut by back crossing it with Chinese and Japanese trees for the blight resistance genes, and also by genetically modifying it, which is a somewhat controversial thing that's happening. The oldest intact tree of the American chestnut is actually in Tumwater at the Mason Cemetery, I believe. It's really cool. I suggest checking it out. As far as chestnut ecology goes, I kind of rolled ecological and social functions into the same thing because in an ideal world, they're the same thing. Um, so one great thing, they're less labor intensive than standard agriculture. They require very little maintenance, maybe a little bit of pruning in the beginning, and then you can kind of just let them go depending what form you want the tree to take. You only have to plant them once rather than tilling the ground every year. Um, and they can be integrated into all sorts of other agricultural strategies, such as hedgerows on the edge of a farm, windbreaks, silvopasture, food forest, etc. So they're a great keystone species for kind of the permaculture guild model of growing food. They're bee pollinated, which is really cool because we like bees. They increase the infiltration capacity of rainwater, so they recharge aquifers, as does any tree, but you know, we're talking about chestnuts. They decrease runoff in an agricultural setting, and they can be integrated into urban forests and parks. So we threw in a little bit about the oak savanna ecosystem because this model can kind of generally be applied to other deciduous trees. Um, and the picture on the left is a oak prairie ecosystem here in Washington. So a savanna, the general definition of a savanna is a plant community where tree density is so low that it allows grasses and other herbaceous vegetation to become the actual dominant plants of the community. This is important because it increases biodiversity in like a grazing setting. It's going to allow a lot of forage for animals and also other plants that might not grow in a crowded forest. Much of this area of the South Sound, all the way down into California, was traditionally oak savanna managed by indigenous folks who would periodically burn the land to maintain this ecosystem. Tan oak and Gary oak up here and tan oak further south were staple foods for 10,000 plus years. Um, and it also promotes, like, basically these areas were food and medicine gardens. There was camas, countless amounts of medicinal and edible plants. So it's kind of a cool model to mimic as a growth strategy. You can see this all around Washington. One interesting place where it's been the most maintained is JBLM, because they use controlled bombing instead of controlled burning. Like basically the bombs set off, burn the forest, and actually have kept this ecosystem going. Not that I'm promoting controlled bombing, but I just thought it was interesting. So this is just a picture I thought I'd throw in Oregon, after the wildfire. I was down there this year and did a little tan oak harvest on the forest floor once it cooled down. Thought that was kind of cool.
So I just threw a couple slides in here as other examples of traditional silvopasture around the world. So integrating like keystone nut tree species with conventional agriculture or pasturing animals. And we see this model with more or less domestication happening all over. So we have the acorn finished pigs in Spain, and we have grazing under oak trees or grazing under chestnut trees. So thinking about chestnuts both as food sources for humans, but also as easy food sources that can be integrated into larger food systems that are ecologically restorative. And then these are a couple of photos of ancient cultivated chestnut forests in Italy. So Chris mentioned those chestnut forests that were planted after the fall of the Roman Empire. And a traditional chestnut tree left untended will grow and survive for a couple hundred years, but they can be coppiced or pollarded and managed, and they can grow for much, much longer. And so there are all of these chestnut forests growing on the mountains and hillsides in Italy that have been managed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And you can see on this picture on the right, all of the rings here of old coppiced poles that have been removed from the stump And if you look at the top left, you can see those new sprouts are actually coming out of this stump as well. And so this is a way that chestnuts and other trees have been used to provide sustainable and reliable sources of pole wood or firewood or construction material without having to take down the entire tree or destroy its root system. And it allows for actually a much faster production of wood than planting an entire forest, cutting it all down and planting an entire new forest. And then it also allows for grafting of different edible varietals, right? And so many of these forests have been managed as chestnut forests, but with many different varieties in them for firewood, for construction, for food, for fodder and forage for animals, and for hunting ground, and a lot more. And just to continue our Italian history lesson, these chestnut forests that were started during the fall of the Roman Empire and maintained for centuries afterwards actually became important during World War II, where Italian partisans who were fighting Mussolini's regime actually hid in the chestnut forests in the mountains, which were virtually impenetrable, and survived off of these chestnuts as a primary staple. So that's a fun little fact. And then hazelnuts, we're not diving into them in much detail here, but similarly, hazelnuts, particularly in Mesolithic Europe, for about 5,000 years, were the dominant food source and dominant tree across the continent. Really high in fat, and good quality fat, and in carbs. And hazelnuts can also be coppiced for wood and for food production and for forage as well. A few years ago, there was a Mesolithic European discovered in Denmark, and I think in some ice or maybe a peat bog, who was named Lola, that they dated back to 5,700 years old. And they determined, based on the analysis of the fossils, that she, before dying, had eaten a meal of duck and hazelnuts, which is a pretty good meal by today's standards, and is the kind of meal that you can really, without much effort, generate pretty consistently if you have these larger scale forestry practices, large coppiced hazelnut hedges with animals foraging underneath them. So I just wanted to throw these in as other examples of this system around the world. You'll also notice there are these lower hazelnuts as a ground cover here, or as an understory, and larger full-sized oak standards that have been unpruned or uncoppiced, allowing for a lot more diversity. By coppicing some trees, allowing others to grow to full height, you get much more complex ecosystems that are much more productive overall. So on that note, I want to jump in a little bit and just talk about the carbon sequestration potential of forests in general, and chestnuts in particular. And we won't get too much into this, but I think that it's worth thinking about. Part of our goal as the Many Trees Project is to start conversations about resilient food systems and adapting to a world where the climate is changing, and also thinking about what we can do to fix and sequester and store as much carbon as possible, knowing also that these small individual efforts aren't going to be sufficient. But looking at this map, this is from a Science magazine study in July of 2019 that concluded that there was room for about 0.9 billion hectares of new forests globally. And interestingly, in this study, they excluded agricultural areas altogether, which is an interesting decision because conventional agriculture is responsible for such a high volume of carbon emissions. And there's so much degraded agricultural land that could easily be converted to food-producing forests. But this study found that planting that many forests would sequester about 205 gigatons of carbon, which is equal to about 2/3 of the carbon that's been emitted globally since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So a not insignificant amount of carbon. It's possible to sequester through trees, and if we combine that with intentionally planting trees that are food sources and habitat and ecosystems, we could start to see a really different and possibly more pleasant world emerging, with lots of intact ecosystems with free food everywhere. So just thinking about that on our local level, chestnuts in particular, and the American chestnut, there have been a lot of studies recently looking at the American chestnut as an excellent candidate for carbon sequestration because it grows so quickly. But chestnuts in particular, in general, grow quickly, store a lot of carbon, and then sequester that carbon even after the tree itself dies, starts to decompose. That carbon enters the soil nutrient cycle, rather than being immediately transmitted back to the atmosphere. So any forest that we establish for the long term ends up being a pretty long-term carbon sinks. And just because here at the Many Trees Project, we like to live in a little bit of a fantasy world sometimes, thinking about the future, I have a little bit of some back of the napkin math for you to think about what it could look like or mean to take tree crops seriously at a local level. And so chestnuts, on average, a mature chestnut can produce about 50% of the grain equivalent calories that an adult needs in a year. So not all of your food, but imagine your corn, your wheat, all of your grains could be replaced by two chestnut trees. You would get that caloric equivalent. And so thinking about what that means in Olympia, if there's 50,000 people here, if we wanted to actually grow enough food locally for everyone to eat, that'd be 100,000 chestnuts, which would equal about 2,000 acres, which sounds like a whole lot of acres of chestnut forests. It's about 15% of the total land in Olympia, so it is a lot. But if you think about the amount of land outside of the city that currently feeds the Olympia area through pretty extensive and destructive monoculture crops, it starts to become a little bit more appealing. And that same amount of trees, 100,000 chestnuts to 2,000 acres, would end up sequestering, at the very, very low end, 5,000 tons of carbon annually. So 100,000 trees, sequestering a whole lot of carbon, building a lot and restoring a lot of ecosystems, cooling local urban environments through evapotranspiration. Sounds like a pretty cool deal to me. So obviously we are not planting 100,000 trees and we don't have that capacity, but we are planting 3,000. So we're 3% of the way there. And it was actually pretty easy for us to propagate and distribute these trees, and easy for anyone to take on a little backyard chestnut propagation or other tree nut propagation effort, on your own terms. So obviously it's just a little thought experiment, but I thought that it was fun to kind of think about those numbers, and what it would look like locally to shift our food sources to something truly local and sustainable and delicious. And then I wanted to also just throw out a few other resources here. So J. Russell Smith was a geographer in the early 20th century, who began noticing and being concerned about topsoil loss through agricultural practices, particularly as people were expanding and began clearing hillsides to cultivate rather than valley bottoms. And when you cultivate annual crops on hillsides, you end up rapidly degrading the topsoil and losing much of it to erosion. And so he ended up in 1929 proposing, totally outside of what we would now see as the permaculture paradigm, proposing tree crops as a staple permanent agriculture to feed people in America versus annual grain crops. And this book is interesting to return to, and to kind of look at these early conversations, noticing the destructive paths of conventional agriculture and the possibility for perennial food sources instead. And then I'd also recommend Eric Tonesmeyer's book, The Carbon Farming Solution, if you want to nerd out about all of this. He has a huge wealth of information about perennial woody polyculture for food production and material production, as well as carbon sequestration rates, and lots of useful information for thinking about this on both a global scale and on a local scale. And then I'll also just mention, for people who are nut tree enthusiasts, there's an organization based out of Minnesota called the Badger Set Research Corporation. And they actually started breeding hazelnuts and chestnuts in 1981. So they've been doing it for nearly 40 years now, with the aim of generalizing larger scale agricultural production of hazelnuts and chestnuts as an alternative to annual crops. And they've done a lot of interesting breeding, trying to develop blight resistance into the American chestnut, as well as crossbreeding European and indigenous North American hazelnuts to produce very hardy and productive hazelnut species, or cultivars. So that's another interesting resource to look at. And there have been a lot of conversations, particularly in the Midwest over the last 5 to 10 years, about transferring a lot of the farmland that is now regularly flooded or is completely depleted and is barely arable anymore into tree crops or perennial tree crops that could allow both for the restoration of the soil and for these smaller family farms to survive when they can't really survive keeping up with big agriculture as their soil is depleted. So there's lots of different experiments around the world and around North America, and up here in our little tiny corner of Olympia, that's a little bit of what's been inspiring us for the Mini Trees Project. So just to jump in a little bit of what we have been doing here, we started a little over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, largely as a group of friends who like to think about trees and food sources and ecology. And we decided that we should try to propagate some fruit and nut trees and distribute them for free to start establishing perennial food sources, and also to start conversations about what it might look like to transition to a world with an unstable climate. And then we kind of ended up accidentally getting 3,000 chestnut seeds dumped in our lap through a collaboration with a group down in Portland, Oregon called Build Soil. And they are trying to get 1 million chestnut trees planted across North America. We were already growing chestnut trees and walnuts and heartnuts and hazelnuts and some monkey puzzles, as well as some fruit trees that we had propagated from cuttings, so figs and currants and grapes. And we ended up having to put everything on the back burner to deal with all these chestnuts that we had all of a sudden. So this is the Chestnut Nursery right after planting, 3,000 chestnuts in there. Not a whole lot of land, actually. Some friends with some farmland let us use a little plot. But you can fit a whole lot of chestnut trees in a nursery bed, planted very, very closely together. So that's in the spring. And then these down in that bottom left, on the left-hand side, is a sprout in the spring. And then on the right hand, these are our seedlings a little over a month ago, starting to turn color and almost dormant enough to transplant. So now that we have them all dormant and ready to transplant, we have been reaching out to people, getting people to sign up who want to adopt these trees, and we'll be working over the winter on digging them up as bare root trees and transplanting them and getting them to all the people who have signed up for them. So there's plenty available. We are hoping to prioritize planting in publicly accessible places. Um, so parks, schools, churches, etc. There's right here, we got some planted last winter over at Jefferson Middle School in a little collaboration with the school there. But also very enthusiastic about people adopting them and planting them in their own yards. And if people are able to do that on their property line or near a fence line, so that when the chestnuts drop, other people can harvest whatever people don't eat themselves in the future, that'd be great. But really, we're just excited about getting a whole lot of chestnut trees and other fruit and nut trees out into the community. Yeah, and then here we just had some little pictures of roasting and cooking these chestnuts. They like to be scored. Many of you have probably eaten chestnuts before. If not, we can have a little Q&A about chestnut recipes at the end of this. But they are delicious on their own and as a staple. And Chris, I think, is going to jump in and talk a little bit about some planting and tree care recommendations, and then we'll take your questions.
Yeah, since y'all are orchardists already, you probably know a lot of this. I'm just going to give a quick overview of the process and then probably open it up for questions. I think would be a more efficient way to do it. This is another picture of one of the chestnut trees planted at Jefferson a little further along. They're even bigger than that now. So chestnut trees do best in full sun, but they can adapt to partial shade just fine. They like well-drained soil. Sandy soil is good. Hillsides are good because it's better drainage. No need to fertilize unless the soil is very poor. Break up the edges of the hole to avoid root binding as you would with a fruit tree. Mulch heavily, ideally, and water 2.5 to 5 gallons per week in the summer drought months. After a year or two, you shouldn't need the water, but don't quote me on that. I don't want an angry person telling me that I killed their chestnut tree. So minimum of 2 trees because they cross-pollinate. More is better, especially since these are all seedling variety trees, which means they have genetic diversity and we won't know exactly when they're going to flower. So having more will make sure that there's viable pollinators. Maximum of 200 feet apart, but closer is better for pollination. This is fun because you can consider coordinating with neighbors. And if everybody in a neighborhood has chestnut trees, you only need to do one, which is a good way of, making friends with neighbors and burying old hatchets and things like that. Full-size chestnut trees can grow up to 100 feet tall, depending on the variety, and up to 50 feet wide at the crown. They don't all grow that big. There's different cultivar varieties that some are dwarf that you can cram into smaller spaces. They should begin bearing in 3 to 7 years and reach full production in about 20 years. Standard orchard spacing, 35 to 40 feet apart is good, but you can plant them closer together. And in fact, a good method is to plant a whole bunch of them and then see which ones do the best. And if they're crowding each other out, then you have a little bit of extra lumber or firewood. There's going to be ample room in the other story for other crops, such as smaller fruit trees and berry bushes, herbs on the forest floor, etc., even silvopasture. And then, so chestnuts do prefer slightly acidic soil. I've heard of them adapting fine to somewhat more alkaline than neutral soils, but for our Douglas fir forest and generally acidic soil, they do pretty good up here.